So I'm guessing you graded the images essays, or?
I did grade the images essay. It was posted on the website.
Oh, okay, got it.
Have you graded that in the Blackboard or in the?
No, I don't. We're only using Blackboard to upload the papers. Everything is on my website. So if you go to markwilson.com, you go to my grades page, you'll see the grades and the comments and the markups are there. So just like with the quizzes and everything. So keep an eye on your grades, because the things that are a significant part of your grades are, accumulating already. The quizzes, the online discussion, and so forth. Make sure that if you signed up for a responses write-up, that you turn those in so that you can get the credit for that. I'm missing a couple of those. If you haven't turned in a images essay, please make sure to do so. There's a lateness penalty, but you're better off turning something in rather than getting a 0 for the assignment. But like I said, we can progress to the research essay as quickly as possible on my part, and in the meantime, you can familiarize yourself through the reading. This week we're looking at the Papyrus of Ani for our online discussions, so make sure to make your comments with regard to that, your first comment and your responses comment. And there is, of course, a quiz that's due on Sunday. And that's what we have for upcoming dates. Obviously, the research essay itself is our next major upcoming date. After that will be the final exam. Both of those are in December, and we'll talk about that as we get closer to Thanksgiving.
Question about the write-up. It says on the website that it's due a week after the discussion's closed. So that means that, for example, I have the Papyrus of Ani. Will that be due on the 13th of November?
The responses close this Sunday, so it will be due the following Sunday.
Okay, thank you.
13th sounds right for that.
I'm confused. What are you talking about? Are you talking about discussion board or the writing out? Which one are you talking about?
What we were just talking about was the write-up for what you signed up for. Which work you signed up for to do a write-up of the responses. That's due the week after the responses close. So that's the thing that you signed up for on the sign-up page. And I know it's a little bit, we have the online discussion and the responses write-up, which is about the weekly primary sources. And then you have the paper that's due at the end of the semester, which is about a primary source of your choosing. So make sure that you're aware of, that there are there are the assignments with respect to the weekly primary sources, and then there's the thing for the paper that's due at the end of the semester, which is the primary source you choose to write about and do research on. And I'll talk more about that once I've handed back the proposals. Any other questions before I continue talking about the glorious kingdom of Egypt? I wanted to talk about Abraham and Isaac. So our reading for last week, what do you think is our takeaway for what the reading from last week, the sacrifice of Isaac aborted at the last minute by Yahweh, what is that telling us about the Israeli Judeo view of the God? Yes.
It shows that their relationship with El or Yahweh has changed, and that Yahweh no longer requires such overt displays of loyalties like human sacrifice anymore, and animals will from now on suffice.
So you think that part of the point of this event is to dramatize how the Hebrews have moved on from the Canaanites' idea of the pagan gods, that they're imminent and demanding and rigorous. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
That makes sense. Because that was my next question: is how is this showing some resonance with the Syro-Canaanite views of the gods that we were talking about the previous week? Is there an element that we can say is consistent, that it isn't a transition away from, that holds some connectedness to the Canaanite view? Yeah.
Maybe the fact that there was still a sacrifice made, just with an actual animal, not Isaac.
Right. So there's still an urgent need to connect directly with God, with the particular God that's important to your community, and the idea that the gods are, I keep coming back to this word that came up in the text, that the gods are immanent. That the Syro-Canaanite gods are present in the world just beyond the veil and actively seeking to interact with their followers, the mortals on earth. This is I think a very strong contrast to some other views of the gods that we've had that see the gods as more aloof and separate and more inscrutable, like the Hittites, who have to use 5 different methods of divination to try to figure out what the gods might be feeling at any particular moment. Anything else that strikes us from the idea of Isaac?
I thought it was kind of interesting how it kind of, I guess, talked about the centric kind of view of the Hebrews, like how God made Abraham cast out Ishmael and his handmaid, the Canaanite handmaid.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows how racial purity is something that they hold very important.
Right. Why is that? Why is there an emphasis on who the followers are? Do you think? Go ahead.
Well, the Hebrews, their relationship with Yahweh was based off their race. So, like, I think that's what it comes down to. So they don't want to dilute it because then it would lower their connection with Yahweh.
Right, and this is particularly important because a lot of these stories are being written after the Babylonian captivity. So the Genesis is put in its final form during and after the Babylonian captivity, when the prevention of assimilation and the ethnic identity of the Jews is of critical importance. Yeah.
I just want to ask about the image, because I'm pretty certain, I could be wrong, but I don't think Isaac was aware he was being sacrificed, assuming that's Abraham and Isaac. I'm just not sure if that's really...
Right, this is a modern painting which has taken a few liberties. The actually grabbing Abraham by the hand is probably... And yeah, so certainly on the way to the sacrifice, Isaac seems to be ignorant of what's going on, which is interesting that that Abraham doesn't tell him and give him a chance to willingly give himself to God, as the ultimate demonstration and proof. This is the fact that Abraham is sort of engaging in deceit in this way with regards to Isaac is peculiar. I wonder what that's about. Why would Abraham be not telling Isaac what's going on? Obviously not to frighten him, but is there a symbolic meaning to that? Like, is there a reason, a religious reason, or a symbolic reason why?
Sorry for saying this. These stories are literally similar to every religion. So I'm from Islamic religion.
Right.
So we have this story, right?
Right. Is it told in the same way? Are there any details that are different?
Yeah,
That you're aware of?
I mean, we don't have any picturization of this.
Yeah, that's kind of the same in Islam.
Yeah.
Right. Well, this is not meant to be Yahweh. This is meant to be one of the angels. But even so, it's a representation of.
Not just Yahweh, any biblical figure that's a sin to display them, whether it be Moses, Abraham.
Isn't that only for students?
It's a big taboo.
Right. Well, and Jews are not supposed to speak the name if you're particularly Orthodox, so there's just a resonance there. But so the nature. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. In our religion, they knew. So it was an order from Allah, and to show his devotion towards his religion.
So Abraham knows and Isaac knows.
Yeah. So to show his faith. So and for to show your faith and devotion, you have to show it to. So when he was doing that, and that time Allah said, you don't have to do it. Instead of that, it become like you can do it with the animals, and there is a celebration.
Which is also the origin of the halal aspect, which slit their throat.
I'm not sure about halal thing, but
Or the Islamic holiday, Eid al-Adha. That's also the origin for. That's also because of this.
Right.
That whole holiday is based on
it
this.
shows his faith and devotion, basically.
So in this version of the story,
Trust, basically.
it's almost, faith itself involves an element of
Yes.
sacrifice,
Mhm.
which in the Genesis version is not so explicit on Isaac's part. The sacrifice is all in terms of Abraham giving up his son, which suggests something about maybe about the patriarchy that was critically important to the community. In my Women in Antiquity class, we talk about this passage also in terms of Abraham's wife Sarah and her lack of involvement in the Genesis story and how that was made up for in the Talmud and in other later rabbinical writings, speculation on the extent to which Sarah is being tested by Abraham being given this command, and how there were multiple opinions about that because Genesis isn't particularly clear. So, for those of you who don't know, Islam is an outgrowth of Judaism in terms of key elements of its origins, and in being a monotheistic religion which is rooted in revelations embedded in the written word, which is characteristic of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of which are sometimes called the religions of the book. And this is in contrast to all of the rest of the religions of the ancient world, pagan religions, which tend to be oral, which tend to be not about the written word. Why is the written word so important in these monotheistic religions? Yeah.
Because regardless of what, if anything happens historically or different events, they're able to hold on to these traditions with them wherever they go.
Right, so part of that is to bring history with you, which is not as necessary if you're rooted in place. Pagan religions are rooted in place, and so you often have your history around you. That's part of it. Why else would the written word be critically important in monotheism?
Just to canonize the faith so it doesn't change and morph into something that it wasn't originally supposed to be.
Right, it's meant to ensure that the understanding of God and the relationship with God is unchanging, because that is what is right and true. That is what you are required to believe. And this is something, as we were talking about last week, is characteristic of monotheistic religions, that monotheistic religions are based on the idea that there is a right way of thinking about the divine and a wrong way. And so the right way must be delineated, and a creed. We in our world are all familiar with this idea of a creed, which is from the Latin for "I believe," and it is a set of words that you are required to believe and to repeat, or to acknowledge the repetition of. And so the written word defines that. The nature of pagan religions does not require a set of beliefs, and that's one of the reasons why our readings for this week talk about such a great diversity of views of the cosmos, because they tend to be not so carefully delineated. Anything else about Abraham? And so I wanted to mention the reason that we're not talking about Islam in this class is simply because it's not ancient. This is, of course, ancient history, and Islam develops in the 6th, 7th century CE, so that's medieval. and that would require a class in medieval religion, which would be very interesting. I would love to teach that, pretend to be a medievalist for a while, as I was. Medievalism was my minor. It would be an interesting class to teach, but it's not the class I'm teaching right now. So let's take a look at ancient Egypt. And its very distinctive viewpoint on religion and the world around us. But ancient Egypt, you know, in a sense, it's where it is now, but Egypt in the ancient world is not the chunk of land that we carve out of northeast Africa and call the nation state of Egypt. Egypt is the lands around the Nile. In the ancient world, Egypt is the habitable portions of land within a few miles on either side of the Nile, and then the delta, which spreads out the Nile as it reaches the Mediterranean. The Egyptian geography consists of two Egypts. The Egyptians called it Black Egypt and Red Egypt, but we tend to refer to it as Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is down, Lower Egypt is up. And the reason for that is, anybody know the reason for that? Yeah.
Because the Nile flows northward?
Right, the Nile flows toward the Mediterranean. And so Upper Egypt is upstream. And Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were originally separate but related cultures that were unified very early in Egyptian history. The story goes something like this. There's a period in which there is a process of unification about which we only have the vaguest of legends. And then the foundation of what we call the Old Kingdom, which is the great and glory days of Egypt, the most famous of Egypt's accomplishments, the Great Pyramids, the Sphinx, the establishment of the nature of the pharaoh, and a lot of the things that we were talking about in terms of how the Egyptians see their gods, the idea of Egypt as intrinsically a single unified people. This lasts for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and 6th dynasties, if I remember correctly. So if we look at the time period, this is 500 years. That's a vast amount of time for a kingdom to be flourishing and stable in the ancient world without undergoing, major transformation. Eventually, the 6th dynasty peters out, and we have a break, and then the Egyptians attempt to recapitulate their past and recover their previous glory. This is called the Middle Kingdom, and it's an effort to relive past greatness. But this is an interim period that only lasts for a couple hundred years, and then the Egyptians fall prey to external conflict and are ruled over temporarily by foreign invaders, probably Semitic peoples from the east. But the Egyptians aren't very good at telling us their history in straightforward, objective fashion. Egyptian history tends to come in terms of the accomplishments of individual pharaohs that we read about on their tomb walls. Actual literature from the Egyptians is relatively rare, and what we do have of it is sometimes late, or is sort of religious-related documents like the Papyrus of Ani. So eventually, the Egyptians were able to cast off their foreign rulers, the Hyksos, and establish one great final period of Egyptian power and empire, the New Kingdom. The problem with the New Kingdom is that the world has changed. At the beginning of Egyptian history, Egypt was able to live in splendid isolation. It was hermetically sealed. It wasn't in great amounts of contact with anybody other than the Nubians they were exploiting to the south. And so they were able to achieve this immensely stable government and a very insular culture that developed its own perspectives and its own way of doing things. And by the time we get to the climax of the Bronze Age, everything has changed. And the economy of the Bronze Age is geared towards mass industry on the basis of bronze, which is a luxury good. And so, as a luxury good, it requires an ever-increasing search for markets and resources and so forth. The economies of the Bronze Age empires become more intensive, more aggressive, and Egypt, surrounded by these powers, the Hittites and the Bronze Age Assyrians and the Mycenaean Greeks, needs to become one of these industrial empires in order not to be invaded and conquered. And so New Kingdom Egypt is a part of the larger world. And that affects the way that that affects its culture, that affects its government, and it affects its relationships with the gods. The Bronze Age collapses, and the New Kingdom of Egypt collapses with it. All of the great powers of the Bronze Age collapse. Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Bronze Age Assyrians, all of the Bronze Age powers collapse. And then after that, the story of Egypt is how Egypt falls into the hands of other powers that are dominating the Mediterranean. First, this is the Persian Empire, which we talked about. The Persian Empire conquers Egypt as part of the establishment of the massiveness of the Persian Empire, and it's how it controls more land than anyone else to that point. The Persians are then conquered by Alexander the Great, and we have the establishment of a Greek dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, ruling over Egypt, which I'll come back to. And then, of course, the empires of Alexander's successors are all conquered in succession by the Romans, because they're there. The last Egyptian pharaoh is who's the last Egyptian pharaoh?
Yeah, Cleopatra the Seventh.
Cleopatra the Seventh, right?
Or her son Caesarion.
Technically, Caesarion rules for a few months, but he's not recognized as pharaoh by the Egyptians. He's not formally installed, but technically, yes. And that was the plan. Julius Caesar has a son with Cleopatra in order to establish a Roman on the throne of Egypt. But then Julius Caesar is killed, and Augustus does things differently. Kills Caesarion, and that's the end of independent Egypt. Egypt is called the gift of the Nile. Anybody know what's distinctive about the Nile that shapes all of Egyptian history? Yeah.
They have these cataracts in it, up and down it, so it doesn't travel pretty hard.
It's right. So the cataracts to the south limit the travel along the Nile to the space of Egypt and Nubia. So that's relevant. Yes.
There's also the flooding of the Nile, which I believe you taught me. The Nile floods less viciously than the other rivers, the Euphrates.
Right. So Because you were in Civilizations of the Ancient
Yes.
World. So some of these slides might look slightly familiar. The Nile is distinctive in the ancient world because it produces an annual flood which spreads fertile soil over the lands around it, which makes agriculture incredibly easy in Egypt. This happens with extreme regularity. Every year the flood comes, and every year the topsoil is laid and the lands are fertilized, and the farms become bounteous. And so as a result, this shapes how the Egyptians think about their gods, which interestingly doesn't really get touched on in the reading for today. I looked up the guy who wrote the section on classical Egypt, and he's such an expert in Egyptology that his name is Jan. It's something like dumbass, but it's not. It's Dumas, right? Anyway, but our friend Professor Jan is focused on particular aspects of Egyptology that interest him. But some of the larger, more basic things didn't get covered. The flooding of the Nile affects how the Egyptians see their gods. How do you think this would affect how the Egyptians see their gods? Yeah.
If nature is providing and is benevolent, then that would translate to the gods also being benevolent and caring, nurturing.
Right. The Egyptian gods, unlike the Sumerian gods, where agriculture is difficult and the climate is harsh, the Egyptian gods are assumed to be benevolent and nurturing. How else would the flood affect the way the Egyptians see the world? If we have the nature of the flood, so first of all, it provides bounty, and so the gods are benevolent and can be relied upon and are nurturing. And the flood is also incredibly regular, which means that the Egyptians expect things to be cyclical and to always return to the way that they are supposed to be. The Egyptians expect permanence over the course of the repetition of many cycles.
I was going to say, if let's say they expect it to be very consistent, maybe it would like spur them to try to make a calendar or something like that, so they can keep track of it.
Or it could lead them to expect things to be so much the same that there's no need for a calendar. The Egyptians tend to measure things in terms of the reigns of individual rulers and dynasties, but they don't have as much importance to them as they do to Egyptologists, I think, because they see each transition of pharaoh as a turn of the cycle. And so this is the continuity is what's important. The Egyptians do develop calendars in terms of their study of the stars, which I'll come back to in a minute. So as a result of this, the way that the Egyptians think about the gods also affects how they think about their king. The Egyptian king, which is called the pharaoh, because in a land where the gods are not necessarily to be trusted, where like Sumer, like Babylon, where the gods have their own agenda and might be as inclined to punish or destroy as to build and create, the job of the king is to act as champion on behalf of the people and intermediate with the gods on the people's behalf to ensure that people and property are protected. This is the job of a king in general, to protect the people and property from hostile people and hostile gods. That's what's called a priest king. And that's what we see in somebody like Gilgamesh, who is often guarded or wary or outright hostile to individual gods. In Egypt, the gods are benevolent. And so the job of protecting the people and property is exactly the intent of the gods. And so the result is that the role of the king is to do the will of the gods, is to manifest the agency of the gods. And this, over time, comes to be understood as the pharaoh is himself or herself, because there are female pharaohs, a manifestation of the gods, in particular the god Horus. And we'll talk about why that is. So the pharaoh is understood to be not a god per se, but that Horus and the gods are taking the physical space of the pharaoh, and the pharaoh is doing the god's will, is acting as a direct manifestation of the gods on earth. This means that the pharaoh is separated from humanity, is depicted larger than life in imagery, is inaccessible to ordinary individuals, is symbolically part of the divine world. So the gods of Egypt are benevolent and nurturing. The gods of Egypt are also mostly depicted as animals, or as humans with animal heads. This is the other thing that I was very surprised didn't really get addressed in our reading. So, what do you think that might be about? All of the religions of the rest of the ancient world, the ones that we've looked at and the ones we haven't looked at yet, when they depict the gods, depict them in human form. Sometimes in a very idealized way that is distinct from how humans are depicted. Sometimes as very much like ordinary people. The Egyptian gods are unique in blending human and the animal. So, any thoughts on what that might tell us? Yeah.
I'm sorry if my head shot, but it might include the fact that the Nile, all these animals would have likely been associated with the Nile, drink from it, and they saw the Nile as a force of nature, and the animal as a force of nature. So it would be right to assume the animals have been associated with gods.
That's essentially what I was saying in a nutshell. That the Egyptian gods are seen to be more directly connected with nature than they are with man. That they are that the forces of nature are much more purely represented in the Egyptian gods, and because animals are part of nature, the connection is made explicit by using this animal anthropomorphic imagery.
And what's the significance of those Greek human animal hybrids like centaurs and minotaurs and medusas and stuff?
Right. So that's an interesting comparison. In Greek mythology, we have races of people who stand between the divine world and the human world. So if you talk about satyrs and fauns and so forth, and nymphs, these are forces of nature that are not fully a part of the divine world, not part of the human world. And so in particular, they are not subject to human order and human morality, but they're also outside the purview of the rules that the gods live by as well. So that shows their in-between status, their lack of, they're belonging to both or belonging to neither. Here we see the Egyptian gods representing something that is the forces of nature as exerted toward humans, rather than among them. So the senior god that is recognized as essentially supreme through all of Egypt is Re, sometimes combined with a more local name. Remember we were talking about the hyphenation of gods? In Egypt, the hyphenation of gods refers to a local tradition that is being bonded to a more general concept. And so if you have something like Amun-Ra, this is a local version of the sun god that is being connected to a larger set of traditions embraced by all of Egyptians. And the original divine couple, Osiris and Isis, Osiris and Isis are sometimes talked about as legendary humans that came to embody the concepts of the gods through their iconic status. The hostile god Set, who, this is an interesting case where I was reading about this, the nature of the animal associated with Set. Part of what's going on here is not simply a combination of forms like this, but also a transition, so that so that Horus, for example, is represented by the falcon. And what this image means actually is that the falcon is a manifestation of Horus. And that Horus, somewhat metaphorically wears the concept of the falcon as part of his appearance in the divine world, which is more about how we wouldn't be able to see the gods as they truly are. So we're seeing metaphors and symbols because the Egyptian gods are so unlike us. So the deal with Set is this is an animal that doesn't seem to actually exist because it has characteristics of the aardvark, but also of other animals. It's not fully an aardvark. It's not fully something else. And the result is that you have an animal concept that is keyed to the story of Set and not to any other traditions that are associated with animal organs.
If falcons are seen as like a product of Horus, then why does Ra also have a falcon head? What does that mean? Like, why?
Re is a manifestation of the sun, and so takes many forms. The falcon, being associated with Horus, becomes associated with kingship and rule, and so the significance of that, I believe, would simply be that Re is in the role of being a king of the gods. But I'm going to double check that because I need to follow up on that to be sure. And the jackal-headed god Anubis who has a special responsibility of seeing to funeral rites. The passage to the lands of the dead is so important that there's a god dedicated to that specifically. Intrinsic to all of this is the idea of ma'at. And this is addressed a little bit in the readings. What's the perception that we get of ma'at? Yes.
It represents justice, the balance of justice, harmony, order.
The balance of justice and harmony and order. The idea that this is the goal of the benevolence of the gods, is to provide order. We've already seen the imposition of order as being a key function of the gods in other religions, such as, for example, with Zoroastrianism, we see that Ahura Mazda is not the creator. The key element of Ahura Mazda is that he provides a pattern of order that is imposed upon the disorganized world. And this is what the Egyptian gods are understood to do. And this is what the role of the pharaoh is in ensuring the will of the gods. So the primal elements of the Egyptian mythology is that the sun god Re places the pharaoh on earth in order to establish Ma'at. This is the purpose of government, the purpose of the pharaoh. And that the pharaoh then has two distinct roles. One is to judge humanity, and the other is to service the gods and the dead. So what's interesting is that these are separate, that the idea of judgment is distinct from distinct from religion, in the sense of religion being the communication between the mortal and the divine. As opposed to other religions where judgment is understood to belong to the gods. It's a subtle distinction because the pharaoh is still an extension of the gods, but the pharaoh is given autonomy to pursue these two roles. His expectation is to develop Ma'at, but the way in which this is brought into being is the responsibility of the pharaoh. The Egyptians see the universe as consisting of Earth and other worlds, and this ties in with the cosmology that we were reading about in the other chapter. And so we were talking about the separation of the gods. The gods are not present in our world like they are for the Assyrians and the Canaanites and the Hebrews. The gods are withdrawn to the celestial world and the netherworld. And so that means that cultic practice is primarily about ensuring communication between the other worlds and our world. But instead of trying to use cultic practice to determine what the gods might be thinking in their world, Egyptian cultic practice is an effort in evoking these gods temporarily into the mortal world, so that they can, so that their nurturing and benevolence can be directly impacted on the natural world. So the nature of the gods is that they have temporary homes on Earth that might be tied to particular places. For each town is sacred to a particular god in the pantheon. Might be tied to particular images or to particular animals. And they would have a temporary visitation when they are invoked by religious ritual. Otherwise, the gods are assumed to be in the realm of the other world. And so in a document like the Papyrus of Ani, when you die, you're understood to be going to meet the gods and to undergo the process of being, of interacting with them. So the book talks about the Egyptians seeing the cosmos as a process. What does that mean? It's a process rather than a space. The word cosmos to us, and in the other reading on cosmology, is the whole of the universe. And so it's a three-dimensional or four-dimensional thing. It's an object. It's a space. It's a structure. It's an engineering marvel. But it's a thing. For the Egyptians, they see it as a process. So yeah. Oh, that wasn't him. Okay. So what is that about? What does that mean to say that the Egyptians see the cosmos as a process? What would that process be? We have a sense of part of it in that. Yeah.
I guess would the cosmic process be that cyclical nature of like the Nile and stuff like that, that claim to it? Or?
So this is the first part of it, is that this process is the fact that that the relationship between the moral and the divine and the nature of the divine world itself, the cosmos collective, is a cyclical series of events, which is reinforced by the Nile, by the movement of the sun, by the movement of the stars. And the other part of that is that just as the flood comes and then recedes, and the seasons change, and the crops are harvested, and the end of abundance comes and then returns. The cosmos is seen as a process of continually overcoming disorder. There's a resurgence of disorder that must be responded to. And so the benevolence of the gods actually takes the form of a constant process of overcoming disorder collectively. This is what the Egyptian gods are actually there to do. And the human function of religion, and the reason that the gods need to be communicated with and invited to participate in these temporary sojourns in the mortal realm, the mortals, are here to assist in them. Our job is to help the gods in their work of ensuring stability and prosperity and overcoming disorder. And so this makes an interesting difference in the study of the stars as one example of this. The Egyptians do everything they can to study and understand the natural world and how it relates to the heavens, where most of the gods are. And And so in other places in the ancient world, there's a advanced study of the stars that is motivated by divination. So the Hittites and the Babylonians and so forth. The Babylonians make great advances in astronomy and astrology, attempting to mark the moves of gods. For these people that are using the stars for divination, they're looking for anomalies. They're looking for deviations. The Egyptians are studying the stars in order to see the consistencies, in order to discern the patterns of cycle and ensure the smooth operation of the cosmos and the part that humanity has to play in that. So the Egyptians developed their own advanced form of astrology that is a part of this expectation of cyclicality and permanence. And Egyptian mythology tends to center around, the Egyptians have a very interesting perspective on the idea of names, that the full name of a being is actually their entire story. And so invoking a being is to conjure their essence by fully describing them. This in particular is manifested in a large number of different mythological stories, but there are three that are of critical importance to understanding the Egyptians. So one is the cosmogony myth. Cosmogony being the story of the origin of the cosmos. And the basic idea of the cosmogony myth is that the gods and humans originally lived together in symbiosis, but at some point in the very distant past, the gods withdrew to the other worlds. And therefore, at that time, they ensured the creation of the state and the pharaoh to ensure that Ma'at continues to be imposed upon the earth. So the cosmogony myth says that the state had to come about, the gods withdrew, and had to have this proxy version continuing their benevolence on earth. The second is the solar circuit myth, which is fairly straightforward, sort of misleadingly straightforward in the sense that the sun god Re is undertaking a journey through heaven during the day and through the netherworld by night. And so the sun passes over our head through the heavens and it passes through the netherworld. And so there's a complete circuit that comprises the sun's journey that is, very much in line with what we've been talking about, the Egyptian expectation of cycles and recurrence and permanence. Perhaps the most important is the Osiris myth, because this is directly connected to how Egyptians live their lives. Anybody know what the Osiris myth is? What that refers to? Yeah.
Is that the myth of birth of Horus? The one?
Yes.
Okay. So Osiris, the first pharaoh, and his wife Isis. Yes. His brother Set, the god of destruction, chaos, was jealous of him, cut him up into many different pieces, scattered his remains throughout all of Egypt. Isis, who got pregnant before splitting up, gave birth to Horus. Horus fights his uncle Set.
Right, and the some versions of the myth say that Osiris is actually revived long enough to impregnate Isis.
But it's missing one crucial.
Right. Well, yes. So but either way, the Horus comes to be the successor to Osiris. Osiris becomes the ruler of the land of the dead, and Horus replaces Osiris and ensures the resurgence of Ma'at by defeating Set and vanquishing the disorder that he created. So the cyclicality of this is that each turning of the pharaoh is a reenactment of this event. And like I said, this is thought of as potentially being a legend of actual rulers of Egypt, where a brother betrayed the king and took power for himself and was defeated by a posthumous son. But the powerful nature of these legends transforms them into gods. This is much discussed in Egyptology, and the perspective on this is much disagreed about. But the Osiris myth is central to the Egyptian conception of the divine. And the role of mythology in general that we can extrapolate from this is to provide analogies between the states of being, between the cosmos and the political state and the fate of individuals. Sort of that nested order of things that we talked about in another class are all part of the same system and are all reflections of each other. So that the Osiris myth talks about the creation of the cosmos in terms of the divine world of Isis and Osiris and Horus, but it also talks about the creation of the state. And the solar circuit talks about the actions of the divine and the expectations of cyclicality, but also is symbolic for the fate of individual souls. So Egypt during the New Kingdom, the main thing that happens, the changes for the Egyptians during the New Kingdom, as I mentioned, the New Kingdom is different because Egypt is more a part of the world. And the interesting effect that this has on Egyptian religion is that it makes it more universalist, that the Egyptians are trying to be more aggressive. They don't have the security of being isolated and separate anymore, and so they're trying to be more aggressive in announcing the superiority of their religion. And this means that the nature of the way in which that the gods are talked about are assumed to be applicable to all people. So this is a break from paganism. But you can see where this is going. This universalism tends to reinforce the power of the sun god, Re in particular, as being the most universal of Egyptian gods. And so, as a result, we have a movement toward what? Evolutionary monotheism. A monotheism that develops naturally out of the supremacy of a particular god. An ultimate expression of this was one of the New Kingdom pharaohs' attempts to reform religion during his reign by jettisoning all of the other gods, or rather subsuming all of the gods into one particular god, Aten, which is a version of the sun god. And that subsumation, so similar to what Zarathustra does with Ahura Mazda, all the other gods become aspects of Ahura Mazda in Iran. In Egypt, Akhenaten, the pharaoh, tries to do the same thing. But part of this is sort of religious fervor and Egyptian patriotism. Part of this is that the nature of New Kingdom Egypt had changed because because Egypt is an industrial power, there are more centers of authority in Egypt than just the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is no longer all-powerful. And so this allowed the priests to develop their own center of authority in rivalry with the Pharaoh during the New Kingdom. And Akhenaten is trying to trump the priests by... I can't say the word Trump anymore. It feels like we've lost that word to the English language. Akhenaten is trying to push the priests down by taking complete control over religion and saying that his God is the only God. And this is why Akhenaten's religious reform ultimately fails, because the power dynamics in Egypt force a return to the previous status quo. How does the coming of the Ptolemies affect Egypt? How does the fact that Egypt has Greek rulers affect religion in Egypt?
Well, for starters, there's going to be a mixture of Greek and Egyptian religion.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, they're going to have foreign rulers, so the process of becoming pharaoh will be much harder for foreigners.
Right, and so the result is that the Hellenistic Greek, the Macedonian rulers, do everything they can to ensure that religion is on their side, to ensure that they are acceptable to Egypt as continuations of Egyptian tradition. This is what the security of their dynasty relies upon. And so they expand the Egyptian religion. Rather than trying to impose Greek thinking upon them, they expand the Egyptian religion, and they rule according to Egyptian tradition and myth, all the way down to Cleopatra. So we start with Pharaoh Ptolemy I, and 300 years later, we've gotten to the end of the Ptolemies, the Macedonian Greek rulers over Egypt, and Cleopatra is still ruling as pharaoh and combining everything that she does that pertains to Egyptian religion and Egyptian tradition is still about reinforcing, still about strengthening, still about ensuring that she is a legitimate Egyptian monarch and legitimate within the sense of being manifestations of Egyptian gods. The Greek influence mainly takes the form of a lot more information in Greek. There's a lot more presence of Greek stories and most of all Greek techniques for making religious aspects part of everyday life. So Egyptian stories are told in Greek. Egyptian gods are depicted in Greek ways. But the net effect of this is to champion to Greek traditionalism. In other words, the Greek presentation of Egyptian gods, sculpting an Egyptian god in a Greek way, is an Egyptian way of saying our gods really are universal. Our gods really are transcendent beyond the gods of anyone else, the Greeks or anyone else. Our gods are manifestable in the Egyptian language or in Greek or in any other form. It's used to promote the supremacy of Egyptian tradition. Where we run into trouble is with the Romans. When the Romans take charge of Egypt after Cleopatra, the Romans aren't interested in directly governing and controlling Egypt. Part of the reason for this is that Egypt is so wealthy because of its agricultural production that the Roman emperors are afraid of Egyptian wealth and power coming into the hands of rival Romans. And so as a result of this, Augustus makes Egypt his own personal, private province. And it is actually illegal for any Roman senator to visit Egypt without the emperor's permission. And this remains true, throughout the period of Julio Claudians and beyond. So as a result of this, the Roman rule is distant and ambivalent. It's mainly about the ensuring of taxes and formulae and the trade that Egypt produces in its agriculture goods and other things, which means that Egypt becomes more cosmopolitan, becomes more heterogeneous in its population under the Romans, as more people go there to take part in business ventures and people migrate from other parts of the empire, and the community of the Jews in Alexandria, for example, is given importance alongside the Greeks and the Egyptians in Alexandria. This remained stable for a fair amount of time, but if you know Roman history, you know that in the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire goes into a period of very dramatic decline, from which it returns, reborn as a Christian empire. But during the 3rd century crisis, the nature of Roman rule breaks down, and the result of that is that Egyptian tradition tends to localize. That Egyptian tradition tends to break away from its huge temples and its large cultic centers, and instead becomes situated and perpetuated in local traditions that belong to individual towns up and down the Nile. And this becomes critical when Christianization comes at the end of Roman rule in the 4th century and beyond. Christianization is aggressively pursued in Egypt because Egypt is such an exotic place, because the Macedonian the emperors, the Macedonian pharaohs, the Ptolemies, had held on to Egyptian tradition for all those years, while the rest of the Hellenistic monarchies became more and more Greek. Egypt became, a bastion of arcane tradition in a world surrounded by Hellenistic peoples. And so Egypt came to be seen as a land of mysticism and magic and wizardry. And when the Christians came, that exotic nature made them a target, made them too pagan, too dangerous, too different in identity to simply rely upon assimilation. Egyptian religion had to be aggressively exterminated. And so the saints that the Christians create from the Egyptian world are mostly men and women who killed large numbers of Egyptian priests or destroyed, Egyptian religious documents, or desecrated a Egyptian temple. The physical destruction of the Egyptian religion was of great importance, and the result of that is that the localization went more extreme. The preservation of knowledge of the Egyptian past was driven underground in villages and local oracular sites, while the larger, more famous places were ransacked or converted to Christian churches. Yes.
When was the Christianization, like, when did that start?
Well, it's for the Roman Empire in general. We're talking about Theodosius, the late 300s, and in Egypt, the aggressive nature of Christianization starts not long after that, because there had been people chomping at the bit to crush Egyptian paganism on behalf of Christianity since before Constantine. Constantine's Edict of Milan says that Christians are to be tolerated alongside other religions, so the Romans weren't giving them carte blanche to destroy just yet. So as soon as Theodosius gives the go-ahead and says that only Christian creeds are allowed within the Roman Empire, this leads directly to particularly violent destruction of religious tradition in Egypt much sooner than anywhere else. Yes.
So it was state-sponsored, like Roman troops were the ones destroying the books and the temples? Or was it like gangs of mobs of Christians?
It's it wouldn't be normally be official. It would be tacitly approved of, but most of it was, volunteers would say, organized mobs that were spending all of their time doing what they could in this direction. There were some cases where where actual armies of people were involved, but mostly dedicated, organized members of Christian churches. Yeah.
So at this point, were the traditional Egyptian religion, was that the minority by this point? Because how could like a minority of Christians just destroy all the Egyptian temples without?
Yeah, it's Egypt is a province of the Roman Empire and officially Christian, so the actual population would have been required to be converted, and so the official population would be Christian. But the people that I'm talking about would be some were from Egypt and some were from elsewhere. So the way in which this pans out is it's also a fairly long process over several centuries, and then all of that is interrupted by the Islamic Revolution in the 7th century. So the Papyrus of Ani, as you read this, gives some thought to the ways that the Egyptians think about the cosmos and their relationship with the gods. The things that I wanted to say about cosmology and history and so forth, I'm going to go ahead and hold that over to next time, because I did want to actually talk about some of those topics. But I will assume that you have read the chapter and that you're aware of these issues and how they inform our reading and also how they inform us. So obviously I'm still working on timing and pacing, but I'm sure that by January I will have it. I will have a cold. All right, so have a good week, and remember to do your posting, remember to take your quiz, and I will see you next Tuesday.